Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of 25 adult fantasy standalones, and because I'm talking about so many, I'm going to go through these pretty quick. If I have in-depth book reviews or wrap-up style videos where I talk about these books more and you're interested in hearing more about them, I'll have videos linked in the description. And then I'm going to have a pinned comment down below where you can leave some other recommendations of adult fantasy standalones that I don't talk about here. There are some other ones that I am aware of and I know about, but I haven't read, and I'm only talking about books that I've read. But either way, because there's so many, I'm going to jump right into it. Kicking off the list, we have Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. This is, for a lot of people, the magic system reminds them a lot of Avatar: The Last Airbender, so if you're a fan of that, definitely pick this one up. When you first start it, it's probably not going to be what you expect, but once you really get into the meat of it, it is incredibly emotionally gripping. It follows a mother and son. Those are our two main perspectives. You do dive into some backstory of the mother, but the main thing that drives the story forward and the plot is that we have this place called Kaigen, where this specific group of people have sort of been fed a lot of propaganda. They believe it is their obligation to, if there is an invasion, protect the rest of their country from anybody that comes in. And so it's a very militaristic society, and we have the son perspective who is starting to see the way that they have been fed lies, and while he wants to question some of these things, it is very dangerous to do so. Next up, we have two books by Brandon Sanderson, and that would be Warbreaker and Elantris. These are both very different from one another, and they all take place in Sanderson's Cosmere, which is his shared universe. I'm sure most of you are familiar, but if you're not, it is essentially like the MCU, but in novel form. And Warbreaker, Sanderson has said if he can, he will likely write a sequel to this one, but as of right now, it has a very satisfying ending and it stands alone. The plot of this one, we follow two women who are sisters, one who has been her whole life trained to fulfill a marriage alliance, but then last minute her father decides to send the other sister who has no preparation whatsoever. And so the sister Divina, who has been her whole life training, decides she's going to go on this rescue mission to help her clueless sister. And then you also follow the sister who is clueless as she is trying to navigate the politics of this other kingdom that she has been married into. Within that kingdom, you also have a perspective of somebody who is essentially a god among men who doesn't believe in his own divinity. And his perspective is quite amusing. Also, in typical Sanderson fashion, the magic system is absolutely fascinating. It has to do in some ways with colors, but it's so much more than that. It's one of my favorite magic systems by Brandon Sanderson, and also there's a lot of humor to this story, so it's a very fun standalone as well. Elantris follows a young man named Raoden, who he, at the very beginning of the story, finds out that he has this illness that then has to force him to live among the people of Elantris. Elantris used to be this glamorous place where people went once they had what used to be a blessing, but now is a curse because people who used to ascend in some ways beyond regular humans, now these individuals become very sick, and every time they harm themselves, they feel that pain basically for forever, but they also can't really die, so they're just sort of stuck in this zombie-like state. And besides Raoden's perspective, where he is trying to make the best of his new life with this illness, we also have the woman that was his betrothed, who he never actually got the chance to meet because it was a political pairing. We also have her perspective, and she is interacting with this priest-like individual who is looking to put a lot of blame on someone, and who that someone ends up being, or the group of people, definitely ties all of the perspectives together. But the other individual, Serene, would be the one that Raoden was supposed to marry. She's the perspective you get where there's a lot more politics going on. After that, we have Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. This technically can be read on its own, but it is highly recommended that you check out the First Law trilogy by this author first, as there are going to be some appearances by some characters in this, and I think it makes for a more enjoyable reading experience if you know those little things that pop up. But either way, this is a classic revenge story. We follow our main character named Monza, and she was a mercenary at one time, but then one of her former employers has betrayed her and harmed somebody that she cares very much about, and she is believed to have been killed, but she survived this harrowing experience and then now is looking to get revenge on the person who betrayed her. And at the time I'm filming this, I have yet to read the other two standalones by him, but there are two more that take place after this one. So if you're interested, you have 3 different standalones you can find by Joe Abercrombie. The next chunk of books I'm going to all kind of combine into one category, which would be mythology retellings. I'll start with the Song of Achilles, as this is one of the most popular. It's often sold in fiction, but I think the amount of fantastical elements is similar to what you find with a lot of other mythology stories that are sold in fantasy. So I'm grouping that one here. This is a story about Troy, specifically Achilles and Patroclus, and you see this as a tragic love story. You see the characters that you've so often found in mythology before, but then you're seeing their relationship explored, and also the downfall of these characters through Achilles, through his pride, and also this desire to be remembered and this obsession with legacy. Some of the other books to recommend here, we have Ariadne and Electra, both by the same author. We have The Witch's Heart and then Keke. So Ariadne and Electra, their thing is focusing on characters from Greek mythology that you have likely not really seen as often as some of the other characters. For example, I just mentioned Song of Achilles. So many of us have seen Achilles explored before. In Electra, you actually do get the story of Troy in some ways, but the characters that are explored in this story are Electra, Clytemnestra, and Cassandra, who are not really actively involved in the fighting. They're more of the people that got left behind, and in some ways I feel like that's sort of a poetic way of describing these characters. They get left behind in a lot of stories. We have themes of motherhood, themes of loss. We see characters feeling betrayed by their family members. We see characters with just absolutely tragic lives. And this is one where it's quite short, but I definitely think it packs a punch. Ariadne, again, this is by that same author. This one is exploring Ariadne and her sister, and where Electra follows more of the characters and the gods themselves are not really incorporated into the story as much. This one shows humans and their interactions with the gods, and while there is some elements of humanity to the gods themselves, you also see the ways in which they are different from humans through the fact that they can live for so long, and the way that they can hold grudges for so long, or the way that how they feel towards humans can fluctuate so quickly because they don't have the risk of dying the same way that people do. And that becomes a huge issue within Ariadne's life, and also just these women who have in a lot of ways their agency taken from them and how they make the best of their lives despite that. After that, we have Witch's Heart, which is Norse-inspired mythology. We follow Angrboda, who is Loki's wife. However, she is not one of the goddesses, and she is trying to live her life in a very modest way. She does end up having children and is known as the mother of monsters as a result of the kinds of children that she ends up having, and the story is very much about what a mother will do to try and protect her children. This one is, I would say, kind of a slower story. It's sort of a character study, but it's one that I think is absolutely fantastic. With some similar themes, we have Keke. This is Indian mythology, and this particular character, again, this is sort of a slower character study kind of book. We follow a woman from the time that she is a young girl. She has just recently lost her mother, and now she's trying to fill her mother's role of being the only woman in the family, and she's having to grow up a lot faster. As a result, she's caring for her brother. She's doing what she can to be a dutiful daughter, but then her life is somewhat upended, similar to the other ones, because her agency is taken away. But the way that she finds her own agency, the way that she always does what she thinks is right, the way that she tries to protect her friends, her people, her children, her family, I just think that she's a remarkable character. All of these are not exactly going to be action-packed, fast-paced, fun stories. I would say if you're looking for more of that, check out Warbreaker. That one is definitely more of a fun time. Or maybe Best Served Cold. These ones are a little bit more serious, and they definitely are the kinds of stories that I think are very emotionally taxing, but also very emotionally rewarding. Next 3 are also technically retellings, though what they are a retelling of is a little bit different. They're not really mythology, and so that makes the tone of these very different from all the other ones I just mentioned. So those would be Uprooted and Spinning Silver, which are both by Naomi Novik, and then the Queens of Innislear. If you're a big fan of literary fiction, I would say the Queens of Innislear out of all of these is probably the best one for you to pick up. This is a King Lear retelling, and I'm not all that familiar with Shakespeare's stories, and so for me, I think I can't even really appreciate this the way that other individuals who are very familiar with Shakespeare could. But I do know that this story, the character exploration is absolutely fantastic. You have incredibly flawed characters in this story, but they're very nuanced. The story is very atmospheric. The writing is very, very lyrical. It's also a little bit like the other ones I talked about, kind of a slower going story. Like I said, a lot of nuance to a lot of it. It's not really action packed, but it is very beautiful, it's gorgeous, it's lyrical, and it's one that I think if you really want to take your time with the book and just sort of just get lost in it, this is a good one. Uprooted and Spinning Silver are both more of fairy tale, folklore inspired stories, and I would say Spinning Silver especially, we're seeing inspiration from actual history, very much a part of the book. We follow a young woman named Miriam, who is the daughter of a moneylender. Her family is Jewish, and there are a lot of really terrible negative stereotypes about them, especially given the profession that her father has. And so he, both because he is probably a little bit too kind, but also because he fears for his family, is not the best of moneylenders. And so his daughter, when she starts to see their family falling into poverty, she starts to see her mother getting sick, decides she is going to do everything she can to force people to pay back what they are owed, and so she can take care of her own family. And in doing this and gaining interest through being a moneylender, she attracts the attention of the Fae, who believe she is turning silver into gold. And this definitely gets their attention. They are very intrigued about this. In their eyes, that's magic. The Fae in this are definitely very frightening. They are not all quite as willing to cooperate with humans, and you start to see that with some of the other perspectives in this story. There's a lot of other perspectives I want to add as well, beyond just Miriam's. The way they're all tied together, I think, is amazing. I absolutely love Spinning Silver, definitely one of my favorites. Uprooted follows a young woman who lives in this village near this, what I'm going to call, haunted forest. This forest is responsible for having harmed a lot of people. It is very dangerous, and in order to be kept safe from this forest, there's a wizard who lives in a tower, who, as long as this village gives one of their young women over to him every so many years, he will protect them from the forest. And part of why the village is okay doing this is because it would seem that the women are fine, that they are unharmed, nothing too terrible is happening to them. With this wizard and them living in the tower, they come out of it actually seeming like they have more for their future. They come out of it very educated, and so they're like, it's a perfect deal. And one day, our main character in this is chosen to be given to the wizard, and she doesn't really want this, she never expected it, and then so now finally you have a perspective that is someone you can follow into this and see what really happens. After that, we have the Wolf and the Woodsman. As far as tone goes, I'd say in some ways it reminds me of Spinning Silver, not necessarily in writing style, but the feel of the time, the way it is tying in historical elements, of which this one definitely does. There's a lot involving both Hungarian and Jewish folklore tied into this, and the way that these different characters in the story come together and initially seem like enemies, but then realize there's more to them that they have in common than they might have expected. And we follow a young woman who, at first it's going to sound kind of like Uprooted, we follow a young woman who is given over to these individuals known as the Woodsman. And she does not want this fate, and she was not supposed to have it because it's supposed to be a magic user who's given over. And she does not have the magic that they need, and so when she's given over, the village is actually protecting the woman who does have the magic, and they're giving this character over instead. And so she now is resigned to this fate. Her mother was taken when she was young by the Woodsman. Now she's been taken. She believes she is going to die. And as she is being taken by the Woodsman, she gets to know a little bit about them. One of them in particular, they grow a lot closer, they start to share different stories, and they start to see some overlap with some of their beliefs. There's also some very sort of creepy creatures that are in this story, so this is definitely a really good one to read in the fall if you're a mood reader. Next up, we have a book I only read recently, but it is now officially an all-time favorite, and that would be Nettle and Bone. If you're somebody who enjoys what feels like a grim fairy tale, but new, and it's not really a retelling of anything, check this book out. The characters are fantastic. The humor in this is amazing, and also the depth in a very short amount of time that the author is able to accomplish is great. Also, the pacing is phenomenal. This is 200 and something pages. Very, very short, but I cannot sing its praises enough. It is so good. We follow a character who wants to do whatever she can to protect and save her sister from a man that she has been married to. The problem is this man is royalty, and the alliance that they have gained through her sister's marriage to this man is protecting their kingdom. Our main character, Mara, really wants to save her sister, but also wants to ensure that her kingdom is protected at the same time. On the back of the book, it says this isn't the kind of fairy tale where the princess marries a prince, it's the one where she kills him. And I think that's a great way to describe this book. But again, I really want to highlight, It's super funny. After that, we have the Bone Orchard. If you're somebody who wants an experience, you want to read something unlike anything you've ever read before, the Bone Orchard is for you. I think it's definitely going to be more of a hit or miss because the way in which it's told and the way that you are exploring the character is so different from what you typically find. It's not going to be everybody's fancy, but again, if you're somebody who's looking for something a little different, the Bone Orchard 100% is the one I would recommend. We follow a woman, or many, who is the king's favorite lady of the night, we'll call her. And the king has been murdered. He is dying slowly, and so before he dies, he is able to tell this woman that he believes it was one of his sons who did it. He is the king, and therefore his sons would gain a lot of power once he is gone. And he does not want the person who murdered him to then also have a lot of power. On top of that, many of his sons don't really seem fit to rule. And so our main character is now tasked with finding the king's murderer. And you know a little bit more about these princes as the story goes on. You see a little bit more to do with the politics. But on top of that, I would say the biggest thing in the story is the character study. So when I said that you follow a woman, the reason I sort of paused at that is because there are aspects of her that have sort of been taken out and put into other beings that she has grown, in a sense. And these beings, she sort of takes certain aspects of herself that she can't cope with right now, that she can't really spend time knowing. There's also mind locks, which are these pieces of technology, I'll call them, that keep you from going too far into certain thoughts. And so there are certain things she doesn't want to remember. And so you're trying to piece together her past through the different perspectives that you get of her and these other aspects of her. After that, we have Deal with the Elf King. This is definitely returning more to traditional, nothing too over the top or unique in its storytelling. We're returning to something more familiar. So this is a part of a series where every book in the series is a standalone, but they take place within the same world. And this would be the first one. We follow a young woman who is a healer. She is somebody who's very passionate about studying the art of healing, and she is living among the humans. And every so often, a woman is to be given over to the Elven Kingdom, and this is supposed to sort of balance out magic, but something has gone wrong because it's been a while before the elves have come to take this particular woman, and you find out it is none other than our main character, and she was sort of being shielded from them because somebody didn't want her to be taken, but the elves find out, they take her, and as a result of this delay, things have been going wrong in the Elven Kingdom. And so our main character, while she very much wants to return home and she feels indebted to her village and to her people because they helped her with her studies, she loves them, but then also wants to do what she can to help the elves because she's seeing that there are people there that she's starting to care about as well. But it also is, there's a romance, you know, a pretty strong romantic plot line in the story, if you couldn't guess by that cover. So if you're somebody who enjoys fantasy romance, I would say this one would be a good one to pick up. Returning to some retellings, next up we have Wild and Wicked Things. And this one is not a direct retelling of Gatsby, but there are definitely a lot of nods to The Great Gatsby. We follow a young woman who, after her father dies, she has been left this house, and so she's sort of starting to live in this home next door to somebody who throws these lavish, extravagant parties, but also it's at a time when witchcraft is sort of looked down upon, and a lot of people on this island believe that the person holding all these fancy parties is a witch. Our main character also is revisiting a friend that she used to have and getting close to her, and you see these three women sort of come together and they're defying expectations of society, but also there's a lot going on with them that is much darker than you might initially expect. And I will say, if you're somebody who likes exploring very morally gray characters to the point where you're like, I don't know if it's even good to enjoy these characters, this one definitely has that, as these characters take part in some pretty terrible acts. A very, very direct retelling of Gatsby, we next have The Chosen and the Beautiful. So this follows the characters and many of these story beats of the original Great Gatsby. It is a lot less of a loose retelling or nod to Gatsby as Wild and Wicked Things. This one, it takes place in the same time period, and there is magic, but the magic in the story is more so sort of giving an explanation to the feeling of grandeur that you got when reading The Great Gatsby, or that the characters had whenever they would visit Gatsby and go to these magnificent parties. The main perspective, rather than being Nick in this story, is the character Jordan. And this is where there are differences in this from the original, in that Jordan is actually an immigrant and she is also queer. So you're exploring that within the story as well, and how that plays a role in how she is viewed in high society. If you are somebody who loves Great Gatsby, I would say check out both of these, as I think there are a lot of things to appreciate about the ways the author has incorporated the original story, but also tweaked things to make it their own. If you are somebody who's like, all right, I want a fun, action-packed, lots of fight scenes kind of a story, but I want a standalone, then the next one, Never Die, is the one that I would recommend picking up. This is like if you combined an anime with a fighting game, like something along the lines of Tekken, because some of the perspectives, or I should say some of the chapters, are literally this character versus this character, and then the whole chapter is kind of dedicated to this fight between these two different warriors and their different fighting styles. And throughout, the main plot line is that we follow this boy who has this magical ability to bring people back from the dead. He wants them to help him fulfill a personal task of his. It very much seems like he wants revenge to some degree, and so there's a little bit of a mystery with that character's motivations, but you are seeing him collect these individuals, these different fighters, so that he can try to accomplish this great task. After that, we have Hall of Smoke. If you look this one up on Goodreads, it does look like there is a sequel, as it says this one is the first, and there's another one where it says it's the second, but the author has clarified that the second one is a companion story, and you actually can read that one on its own, and you don't have to read this one first because it's not a direct sequel. So it is a standalone. We follow a young woman who is a warrior priestess. She is a priestess to this warrior-like goddess. And at the very beginning of the story, something terrible happens to, we'll say, her home and her family, all the people that she cares about, and she believes it is her fault as a result of failing to do something that was tasked to her from her goddess. So there's a lot of questions throughout the story of whether or not the gods and goddesses are literally intervening in their lives, if it is the character's fault or not. And she is gripping with grief throughout the story, but also trying to do what she can to help some people that she meets along the way. And then there's sort of this, like I said, there's this mystery surrounding the gods and goddesses and the beings that they worship. There's also the question of how divine are they really? Next, we have the inheritance of Orchidia Divina. This follows a woman who is the matriarch of a family, and she is now dying, and so she has called a lot of her family members to her to give them some instruction, to let them know about their inheritance before she dies. The way in which she is dying is definitely leaving no question that there's some kind of magic involved, either with her or with the land that her home has been built upon. And so now the individuals, the family members that she has left behind, they are now trying to figure out what has caused her death, and also what kind of magic there was in her own life that led to some very strange things that occur in their own. This one I would say is really good if you are a fan of magical realism. I don't think it fits as comfortably in the fantasy genre, nor do I think it fits super comfortably in fiction. I think it's somewhere in between, and that's why I really want to emphasize if you like magical realism, because I do think magical realism does sort of sit between those. If you like that genre, this one would be one I think to check out. After that, we have Sorrowland, which is another somewhat genre bender of a book, in that it has elements of horror, it has elements of sci-fi, it has elements of fiction, historical fiction, and then of course fantasy. And this follows a very young girl who, she has grown up primarily living in what I'm going to call a cult, and after having escaped this place, she had been forced to marry a man who was older than her. Again, she was very young. And it's a very dark story, so it's not one to pick up if you're looking for something fun. But she ends up having twins, and because she has escaped, she is living in the middle of the forest. There's a lot to do with how certain individuals have been mistreated for the advancement of others. There's a lot to do with the forced removal of certain people from their homes. There's a lot to do with identity in the story, the independence of children, gender. There's just so many things that the author explores in this book. Next, we have Ocean at the End of the Lane. This one is very, very well known. I'm sure a lot of you have even checked it out yourselves. And this is another one that I would say is a genre bender, as it leans very heavily into the horror genre in a lot of ways. We follow a young boy who initially his life seems very typical, very normal, but then very strange things start to occur. This being that doesn't really belong starts to come into his life, and they seem very set on giving people what they want, but what that actually entails is very twisted because this being themselves is not a human. This one is definitely more of a vibe, I'll call it. There's sort of this aesthetic that, once again, if you are a mood reader, similar to what I was saying earlier about The Wolf and the Woodsman, I think this one, because there's these incorporations of these darker elements, these darker creatures, this would be a good one to pick up in the fall. And then last, and I think kind of needed because so many of these have been very heavy or talking about difficult topics, the last two are charming and cute and sweet and wholesome in a lot of ways, and that would be two books by TJ Klune, Under the Whispering Door and House in the Cerulean Sea. So both of these are exploring different things, but I think that the tone and the writing style of these are very similar to one another. House in the Cerulean Sea, its main thing is exploring the children in the world who don't really fit in based off of society's expectations, and it dives into why everybody deserves to be loved, why everybody deserves to have a home. And then Under the Whispering Door is sort of a what-if exploration of what happens when we die. We follow a man who was not really the kindest of people. He dies, and he is in this in-between before the afterlife, where he is given a chance to come to terms with his death. And he is very much struggling to do this. But in this in-between, he has an opportunity to see other individuals as they are transitioning to death and the afterlife. And so within both of these stories, you have these heavier topics, but TJ Klune definitely approaches them with a very sweet, cheeky writing style that I think a lot of people are going to really enjoy. That's it finally for 25 adult fantasy standalones. Like I said at the beginning, because I wasn't able to go super in depth with these, I will have any other videos I've done in the description bar for all of them, so I'm going to have timestamps down below and other videos that you can check out. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. I hope that you find some adult fantasy standalones as a result. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.